All right, welcome back. And I'm wondering, did you take the test and what did you turn out to be? This is the fifth in our accelerated NLP training series. This is the fifth program. And just before we started or finished the fourth program, we asked you to take the representational system preference test to see if you were primarily visual or auditory or kinesthetic. Let's go through page 17 and 18 and see just exactly what that means. What does that mean? What in the world does that mean? Okay, so if you look at, let's look at number one on page 17. It says, I make important decisions based on, if you made important decisions based on gut level feelings, of course, that would be kinesthetic. If you made important decisions based on auditory, that would be which way sounds best. If you made important decisions based on what looks best to you, then that would be visual. And if you had precise review and study of the issues, that would be auditory digital. During an argument, I'm most likely to be influenced by the other person's tone of voice, which is auditory. Whether or not I can see the other person's point of view is visual. The logic of the other person's argument is auditory digital. And whether or not I'm in touch with the other person's true feelings, of course, is kinesthetic. I most easily communicate what's going on with me by the way I dress and look, that's visual. The feelings that I share, kinesthetic. The words that I choose, auditory digital, and my tone of voice would be auditory. Now, auditory digital simply means it's a more dissociated way of thinking, and it's also unspecified. In some of the handouts we have, it's called unspecified, which means it's not specified as to representational system. It's more left-brained. Let's look at number 4. If it's easiest for me to find the ideal volume and tuning on a stereo system, to select the most intellectually relevant point in an interesting subject, well, the first would be auditory, and the second would be auditory digital. The third would be select the most comfortable furniture, which would be kinesthetic, and select rich, attractive color combinations would be visual. And number 5, I'm very attuned to the sounds of my surroundings, which would be auditory. I'm very adept at making sense of new facts and data, auditory digital. I'm very sensitive as to the way articles of clothing feel on my body, that's kinesthetic. And I have a strong response to colors and to the way a room looks, is visual. So maybe you began to notice that people use certain words to describe their experience. Let's look at page 19. On page 19 is a list of predicates. Now, predicates are words that essentially refer to a certain representational system. The visual predicates are on the left, the auditory in the middle, kinesthetic, and the unspecified, and those are in the 4 columns across the top. Visual people tend to memorize by seeing pictures. They're less distracted by noise. They often have trouble remembering, and certainly are bored by long verbal instructions because their mind may wander. They're interested in how the program looks. Typically, auditory people are easily distracted by noise. They can repeat things back to you easily and learn by listening. They like music and like to talk on the phone. The tone of voice and the words used can be important. Kinesthetic, they often talk very slowly and breathily. Is that a word, breathily? I think it is. Anyway, if it isn't, we just put it in the dictionary and there it is. They respond to physical rewards and touching. They memorize by doing or walking through something. Now, they'll be interested in how a program feels, if it feels right or gives them a gut feeling. And finally, unspecified. They spend a fair amount of time talking to themselves. They memorize by steps, procedures, and sequences. They'll want to know the program makes sense to them. They can also sometimes exhibit characteristics of other representational systems. Now, what's really, really interesting is we taught this to a group of commodities futures brokers quite a while back now, I think at least 10 years ago. And their average income from a new account was about $5,000. We managed to triple it, and one of the things we simply did was we asked them to pay attention to the voice tonality of the person as they phoned in. Listen to whether they're visual and or auditory or kinesthetic or unspecified, and then to throw some predicates at them and notice which one that they responded best to. We actually have a tape of a guy who calls in and he goes like this. The fellow on the other end of the phone goes like this. He goes, hello. And the salesperson goes, hello. And then the guy says, hello, I'm from International blah, 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 commodities traders. And the guy on the other end of the client on the other end of the phone said, I've told you not to call me. I don't want to talk to anybody. I really just can't stand talking to you people. And the salesperson on the end of the phone decided that this fellow was kinesthetic. So he slowed his voice way down and he said, I know. He said, and he told me later, he said, I went right down the list. He said, so if you look at the list on page 19, this is roughly what he said. He said, I know how you feel. He said, we haven't given you anything that you can really touch, nothing you can really grasp or get a hold of. In fact, the information probably has been slipping through your fingers, nothing you could catch on to. And the guy on the other phone, after he got halfway down the list, the guy on the other end of the phone goes, yes. He said, you're the first person who's ever communicated with me. And he ended up opening a nice account with the fella. So words are only 7%. Yet what we're going to do here is learn how to communicate using words. But we're going to learn how to communicate using words included in different representational systems. You probably like the words that are in the representational system that you use. You know? So if you're visual, you probably like to take a look at something and see how it's going to be. If you're auditory, you like to hear the right sounds. And if you're kinesthetic, you like to just sort of get a feel for things. So we're going to talk about how do you use these words that include different representational systems. And because this might surprise you, there are a lot more people out there in the world than who are different from what you're doing. Roughly, and we think this is a rough average. We think about 40% of the people in the United States are visual, and 40% of the people in the United States are kinesthetic, and about 20% of the people in the US are auditory and auditory digital. Now, people change from moment to moment. They change from week to week and year to year. Different things that happen in people's lives mean they utilize different representational systems from time to time. So just because you tested this way today doesn't mean that you'd test this way tomorrow. And I think it's real important that we don't use this information to pigeonhole people. I think it would be real unfortunate if someone who had come to take one of my trainings went home and said, I'm a kinesthetic and that's good, or I'm a visual and that's the best. I think rather than saying that, I think the best way to look at it is I'm primarily using visual representations right now at this stage in my life. I think that's really important, but what's more important is the use of these words to begin to gain rapport. The very, very important things about beginning to move and begin to gain rapport. Now, the first thing we taught the folks at International Trading Group was to match voice tonality. The second thing we told them to do, or taught them how to do, was to match predicates. So within 5 minutes, they could know a person's representational system. And so, for example, here, think about this for just a minute. If you're calling me on the phone, and I answer the phone like this, hello, what is that? It's probably more visual, right? Now, if I answer a phone like this, they pick up the phone, they go, hello, that's probably either auditory or kinesthetic. Now, if I answer the phone like this, hello, that's probably kinesthetic, right? So auditory, if I'm answering the phone auditory, I go, hello, and you'll hear the mellifluousness of the voice, the resonance of the voice. That would be more auditory. Listening to each of those kinds of the way the phone is answered, you can begin to pick up on exactly whether the person is visual or auditory or kinesthetic, or perhaps not, in which case you might say, well, maybe they're auditory digital. Now, typically what we figured out was that people who had quickly grouped words with lots of interruptions of or ah probably were visual or auditory. This is on the speech patterns now on the bottom of page 19. And they would have, the people who are kinesthetic or unspecified might have deliberate phrasing and or long, complicated sentences. The processing pattern for someone who is visual or auditory might be quick with a minimum of detail, and they might let you know unconsciously when they understand by changing the subject. Someone who is kinesthetic or unspecified might want more detail or might have more detail. They might not give you an indication of understanding unless you ask them. Now, being aware of the way the person is speaking while you're talking to them you can begin to test and send and use predicates to talk to them. You can begin to say, if you think the person's visual, they pick up the phone, they go, hello, and you go, hi, how's it going? I want you to take a look at something that I'm going to ask you just to show it to you. And of course, but you see, you're talking to them on the phone, but nevertheless, you can still use visual predicates. Of course, it's also just as easy to do it. It's also just as easy to do it when you're in person is to use the visual predicates, but it's also equally effective to use it on the phone. Now, in NLP, our belief is that the descriptions that we use to describe what's going on in our head are not metaphorical descriptions, but they're actually real and accurate descriptions. If someone you're talking to says, I don't see what you're saying, the truth is they just don't see it. So what does that mean? That means they've been unable to make a picture in their head based on the amount of information you've given them. If somebody says to you, what you're saying to me doesn't sound right, it very well may mean that your tone of voice is not appropriate for them to be able to decide that. And if someone says, I don't feel right about this particular issue, that means you haven't said the right things that would cause them to have that kind of feeling inside themselves. Now, if someone says this doesn't make sense, what they're telling you is that you haven't given them enough logical, reasonable, rational, digital information about what they're deciding on. Now, one of the things that Virginia Satir used to do, and I mentioned Virginia Satir early on, one of the things that Virginia Satir used to do is she would, when she did couple counseling, is she would do translation. So this is the process of translation. This is how it works. She would actually translate from one representational system to another. So let's look at our predicates on page 19, and let's just go down the list here first of all. Visual predicates include see, look, view, appear, show. It's going to dawn on you. I'm going to reveal this to you. Envision, illuminate, imagine, clear, foggy, focused, hazy, crystal, picture. Those are all visual predicates. Auditory predicates include the words hear, listen, sounds, to make music. That's music to my ears. Harmonize, tune in, tune out. I'm all ears. It rings a bell. Silence, to be heard, to resonate. Deaf, mellifluous, dissonance, question, and unhearing. Those are all auditory words. Kinesthetic words include feel, touch, grasp, to get a hold of, to slip through my fingers. The meaning slip through my fingers. I can't catch on to what you're saying. Tap into, make contact, throw out, turn around. Hard, unfeeling, concrete, scrape, get a handle, and solid. And the unspecified, which we call auditory digital, includes the words sense, to experience, understand, think, learn, process, decide, motivate, consider, change, perceive, insensitive, distinct, conceive, and know. Now, let's see how this would work. Virginia Satir used to have somebody come in to her office, and she would actually do translation for them. The funny part about it is, in the early days of NLP, we actually had a tape of a therapist. And this is so funny. This is not Virginia, but someone else. This is where we got the idea from originally, in fact. And we had a tape of a therapist, and the client would come in and say, I just don't see how I can relate to my current job. And the therapist would say, well, how does that feel? And the client would say, feel? I'm not sure if you understand what I'm saying. I'm not sure if you can. What do you mean feel? Can you see what I'm saying? He said, I want you to see that I can't relate to my present job. I just don't see how I can get along with my boss. And the therapist says, well, how does that feel? Now, the interesting thing is that the therapist is mismatching the client's representational system. And quite frankly, someone who's visual may have no idea how it feels. But the issue is for them is not how it feels. The issue is that the person can't see how to relate to the present boss. Actually, what happens when you do that is it just blows out the rapport. Now, one of the things that Virginia Satir used to do, and this is kind of fun, is she used to actually translate. So when a husband would say, I just don't think, I just can't see how my wife can do that, and maybe she would be kinesthetic, he'd be visual. She would actually translate, and she would say, so here's an example. She would say her husband, let's say the husband was kinesthetic and the wife was real visual. So she would say to him, he would say to her, you don't give me hugs anymore. And Virginia would ask the wife, what's up? And the wife would say, I remember how good he used to look when he wore his uniform. And so Virginia would say to the wife, you know how you feel when you looked at him when he wore the uniform? And she'd go, yes. When you see the uniform, she would go, yes. And the wife would say, and Virginia would say to the wife, well, that's how he feels when you give him a hug. So she would actually do translation, where she would translate across representational systems from one representational system to the other representational system. So translation is a very valuable process. And one of the things we've done in exercises is to have somebody start a story in visual and someone continue the story using auditory predicates and continue the story using kinesthetic and then auditory digital. You are probably better at one set of representations than another. You probably are best at some, and you're probably best at the one you tested most highly on, and you're probably least good at the one you tested the lowest on. As an NLP practitioner, it probably would be a good idea if you learned how to use all of the different representational systems. And so I think you should practice them. I think as you think of the predicates that you're using, I think probably you ought to practice them and pay attention to the words that come out of your mouth. Listen to the people around you as they unconsciously talk. And they're going to use these predicates to describe their internal world. If you hear someone using predicates to describe their internal world, you can match those. You can match those predicates as they talk. If you hear someone say, that just doesn't look right, you can say to them, do you see what I mean? And they're going to feel more comfortable. If they say, well, I really have to think about it. And you could say, well, does this make any sense to you? So as you pay attention to the words you hear, you can begin to use the predicates. Let's look at the bottom of page 19 and finish up. The decision thrust was actually how would you use this to begin to move a person toward a decision. And for visual or auditory, generally it was abstract to global, which we'll talk about later, and perhaps a speculator or a gambler. It went fundamental to specific, and for kinesthetic and unspecified, and this would be an investor or a speculator. And then we would close on the issue of being ready to take advantage of an opportunity for visual and auditory, or kinesthetic and unspecified, let's study the markets and plan some strategies. The tone of voice for the close for an auditory or visual would be slightly fast and excited. For kinesthetic and unspecified would be thoughtful, considerate, and just above monotone. Now, page 20 is also a list of predicate phrases which you could use. Predicate phrases. So a visual person might use beyond a shadow of a doubt, or a horse of a different color, or in view of, or make a scene, or in the mind's eye. An auditory person might use give me your ear, or hidden message, hold your tongue, pay attention to. A kinesthetic person might use all washed up, or get a handle on this, or hang in there. So here are some additional phrases you can also use when matching or mirroring someone's predicates. Now, remembering that a visual person is going to make a decision based on whether this decision looks right, then the best way to approach a visual person in making a decision is to say to the person, if I can show you an attractive way in which you could, and then give them a potential benefit or their values, that you'd want to at least look at it, wouldn't you? If this looks good, we'll go ahead and focus in on getting the paperwork done. To an auditory person, we'd say, if I could tell you a way in which you could, and then a potential benefit or their values, you'd at least want to hear about it, wouldn't you? And if this sounds good to you, we'll go ahead and discuss how to set up an account. And then to a kinesthetic person, we'd say, if I could help you get a hold of a concrete way in which you could, and then potential benefit or their values, you at least would want to get a feel for it, wouldn't you? And if this feels good to you, we can go ahead and set up the account by handling the paperwork. And then finally, to an unspecified person, and this isn't written down in your notes, to an unspecified or auditory digital person, we could say, if I can show you something, or if I can give you something that makes sense, that is something that we both think will work, that is something that you'd like to proceed with, wouldn't you? So an auditory digital person, we can begin to talk to them in unspecified, and each person's going to make decisions differently. Each one of these people is going to make a decision in their own way. So using predicate phrases is going to make a real difference using predicate phrases is going to make a real difference. Now, if we begin to use these, what will happen is we'll actually increase our chances for rapport. We'll increase the chances for rapport, and we'll increase the ability that we've got to produce the kind of results. So predicate phrases, we're going to throw these in the pot. We're going to sort of stir these into the pot of rapport. We're going to just take a moment and stir those into the pot of rapport and begin to utilize them. Let's look at page 21. It's useful to be able to notice whether a person, just from their body physiology, is visual or auditory or kinesthetic. We've been talking up to this point about predicate phrases and rapport, and actually doing them on the phone, which is useful. But if you're in person, you can actually look across at the person and see, maybe you can get a chance to look and see whether the person is visual or auditory or kinesthetic or auditory digital. And here are some ways to notice that. This will actually give you a sort of a quicker way to notice and perhaps match them in a quicker way or a more easy way. So let's look at page 21. Someone who's visual will often stand or sit with their hands or bodies erect with their eyes up. They'll be breathing from the top of their lungs, as I mentioned before. They may sit forward in the chair. A visual person will tend to be more organized, more neat, more well-groomed. They're often thin and wiry. They memorize by seeing pictures and are less distracted by noise. They have trouble remembering verbal instructions because their mind may wander. A visual person will be interested in how your program looks. Appearances are important to them. Someone who's auditory will quite often move their eyes sideways. They'll breathe from the middle of their chest. They typically talk to themselves. They may be easily distracted by noise. Some can even move their lips when they talk to themselves or repeat things back to you. They learn by listening. They usually like music and talking on the phone. They memorize by steps, procedures, and sequences. The auditory person likes to be told how they're doing and responds to a certain tone of voice or a certain set of words. They'll be interested in what you have to say about your program. Someone who's kinesthetic will typically be breathing from the bottom of their lungs, so you'll see their stomach go in and out when they breathe. I mentioned earlier belly breathers. They often move and talk very, very slowly. They respond to physical rewards and into touching, and they also may stand closer to someone than a visual person. They memorize by doing or by walking through something. So they'll do a walkthrough, or they have to do the process of it. And they'll be interested in if your program feels right, or if you can give them something they can grasp. Auditory digital people will spend a fair amount of time talking to themselves. In fact, I can remember one auditory digital person that I worked with who actually repeated every instruction back to them. Repeated every instruction back to them. Whatever instruction that you gave them, they would actually go down into auditory digital with their eyes. They'd move their eyes down into AD, and they would actually give you back or think about what you said before they could give you anything back to you. So this person may spend a fair amount of time talking to themselves, and they'll want to know if your program makes sense. The auditory digital person can also exhibit characteristics of some of the other major representational systems. Okay. So with that in mind, I want to chat just for a moment about your own intonation patterns before we move on to eye patterns, because I think this is important for us to look at. Let's look at page 22. Page 22, right? Now, the arrows indicate the tone of voice. And there's 3 different ways that we can communicate in the English language. When you come to the practitioner training, we'll actually do an exercise on this, and we'll do an exercise where you can learn how to do voice matching at this point. Voice matching is extremely powerful, and we'll go through all of that in our practitioner training. Be very, very easy for you to pick up. If you want to practice it this week, by all means, go right ahead. Feel free to do it. So let's talk about, there's 3 major constructions that we use in terms of tonality in the English language. The first type of tonality is the questioning tonality. And let me take all content out of here, so I'll just use the word word, and that means word, word, word. Word, word, word just means a sentence. Okay? So the questioning tonality would go like this. Word, word, word. That would be a question. Now a statement would be word, word, word. Word, word, word. That would be a statement. A command tonality would be more like this. Word, word, word. Word, word, word. So you move your voice down, it becomes lower and a little bit louder. Now, the most powerful form of syntax in the English language is a questioning syntax and a command tonality. So here's one of the things we mentioned. This is one of the things we did with all of our salespeople is we listened very carefully to the tone of voice that they use. Listen very carefully to the tone of voice that they use when they're asking for an order. So the tone of voice might be, can you send me a check? Now notice if I say it that way, I sound like I'm uncertain about what I'm saying. Can you send me a check? It sounds almost like I don't know what I'm asking for. It almost sounds like myself that I'm uncertain. I'm uncertain about what I want. So if I used it this way, like what if I said to you, can you send me a check? In that sense, I sound more certain about it. And that's one of the things we do for all of our telephone salespeople when we're doing trainings, as well as for the people we've trained, and quite frankly, either in person when they're doing in-person sales or on the phone. And quite frankly, the command tonality works a lot better. It really, really, really seems to produce better results. So whenever you're using certain tonality, make sure whenever you're talking to someone and paying attention to that, use your tone of voice. Use your tone of voice in a way that's going to produce results for you. All right, let's move on to page 23. And this by the way, is some of the most fun stuff for me in NLP is the eye patterns. Because here's the thing. People move their eyes in all different kinds of directions, don't they? Have you ever watched people, you talk to them and they move their eyes up and down and all over the place? Do you ever wonder why they're doing that? Do you ever wonder why they're doing it? Well, there's a reason, actually. And the reason is they're actually doing things inside their head. Now, this particular eye pattern chart is a normally organized chart. So this is someone who's normally organized. That doesn't mean that someone who is not organized this way is abnormal. It just simply means they're reversed. When we say normally organized, what that means is that the majority of people, and I think roughly 80% of people or more in the United States or in the world are organized this way. My experience of looking at eye patterns over the years is that everyone is either this way or 100% reversed. Now, there are some exceptions to that, but let's talk about that for a moment. Let's talk about eye patterns. If you've watched people for a while, perhaps even since the beginning of when we talked about sensory acuity, you may have noticed that when people move their eyes in certain directions when they said certain things. The person might have said to you, yeah, I can see that. And they might have moved their eyes up as you looked at the person. They might have moved their eyes up and to the right. Or the person might have said, that just doesn't sound right. And they might have moved their eyes horizontally to the right. Somebody might have said, well, I just don't get a feeling for that. And they might have moved their eyes downward and to the left as you look at them. Well, these eye patterns are also quite useful because we can get an idea of what's going on inside the person's head. So let's look at page 23 now. The left-hand side of the eye chart is constructed, for the most part, and the right-hand side is recalled. And at the top, it's visual construct and visual recall. Visual construct on the left as you look at the person, and visual recall on the right as you look at the person. Now, what's really handy about this is to make it easy for you to memorize this chart, which I would recommend, is that it's alphabetical order. So when you're looking at a person, construct is always on the left and recall is always on the right, unless the person is reverse organized, in which case it's totally reversed. So someone who's normally organized, and there's a high percentage of this, it's related highly to right-handedness. So someone who's right-handed usually will be normally organized, except, of course, I've met people who are right-handed and reverse organized. So as you look at the person, someone who's making sounds in their head or remembering sounds or creating sounds are going to be moving their eyes horizontally. And on the left-hand side is auditory construct, and on the right-hand side is auditory recall as you look at the person again. Now, down at the bottom, on the left-hand side is kinesthetic, and on the right-hand side is auditory digital. Kinesthetic is their feelings, that is their internal feelings, and auditory digital is self-talk. Now, what's interesting is, I think you know enough of NLP that you're beginning to see some things. And you're beginning to see some things, perhaps even if you had seen them and didn't notice, you're beginning to see some things that you hadn't realized you were seeing before. Now, I think many of you were surprised to discover you could actually hear certain tones of voice and begin to match them. and that you could actually get into rapport with somebody. Yes, so as we go on now and begin to look at the eye pattern chart, this is extremely useful for knowing what a person's doing inside their heads. So for example, if a person looks up to visual, as you talk to them, perhaps they look up to their visual recall, you could say to them, do you see what I mean? If you're talking to them and they move their eyes horizontally, you could say to them, does that sound right? If they move their eyes down and to the left, as you look at them, then you could say, do you get a feel for what I'm saying? Or if they move their eyes down and to the right as you look at them, and you could say, well, does that make sense? So having learned how to watch the eyes, you can begin then to match the predicates that we've just learned to the eye patterns. And then you'll have a broader range of behavior available to you. As you discover, you'll have greater and greater flexibility. As you grow in the flexibility and the capability of using these predicates with the new sensory awareness that you've learned, paying attention to skin color and skin tonus, the symmetry of the facial muscles, watch the breathing, the rate and location, the pupils, the eye focus, pupil dilation, listening to the tone of voice, noticing the predicates. Now you can simply stir this into the pot, add this in, and pay attention to their eye patterns. Paying attention to their eye patterns. And noticing exactly what they're doing. You can begin to notice that a person moves their eyes in certain directions, and you can wonder, what are they doing inside their head? For a while, I even asked people, did you just make a picture? And they said, yes. How did you know? How did you know? And in fact, as you begin to look at this, of course, people move their eyes very quickly. People move their eyes. Some people move their eyes very slowly. Some people actually close their eyes when they move their eyes. I've seen people who actually close their eyes and move them in a certain way. If the person closes their eyes, it doesn't mean you can't see them easily, because you can still look at the eyeballs underneath the eyelids. In fact, I know an NLP practitioner who can read eye patterns from the back of their heads. Now, I'm not sure if you can do that yet. But what he does is he calibrates from the micro muscle movements in the back of the head and watches the head move minutely, the minute movements as the person moves their eyes in certain directions. So as you begin to pay attention to eye patterns, notice that usually when these eye patterns occur is when someone is constructing something or recalling something in terms of bringing up a memory. Now there's one other thing. Sometimes when a person is bringing up a memory that is sort of easy to remember, then oftentimes they just defocus their eyes. And if they just defocus their eyes, that doesn't mean they're not moving to a certain place. It means the memory is really, really easy to remember. It's like really right out in front. Now, the first thing I think we're going to want to do when we use eye patterns is to discover whether a person is normally organized or reverse organized. Discover whether a person is normally organized or reverse organized. Someone who's normally organized will have the eye pattern chart on page 23. A person who is reverse organized will have the exact mirror image of this chart. In other words, just turn it over and look at it through the light, and look at the backside of it through the light, and that's the exact way that their eye patterns will be organized. Here's a tip-off, by the way. One of the things I use is usually the watch is in auditory digital. I've noticed that the person will usually look at their watch with the auditory digital part, because that's the easiest place to comprehend time. Now, that's not always the case. In fact, one time we met a guy in, where was he? In Honolulu, who was working for the Pat Kelly hotels. And he had his watch on his right hand. And so we said to him, say, you're right-handed, or left-handed, aren't you? And he said, oh, no. Oh, he said, how'd you pick that up? Oh, the watch, he said. He said, I used to be a bouncer. And he said, so I put my watch on my right hand just in case I had to sucker punch somebody, they wouldn't see it coming. So it's not always the case, but usually if you look at a person's watch, that's usually a very quick way of discovering whether they're normally organized or reverse organized. Someone who is normally organized will usually wear their watch on their left hand. And normal organization generally means right-handed. Now, it's also possible for someone to be normally organized and left-handed. It's also possible for someone to be reverse organized and right-handed. Usually reverse organized right-handed people are people who were brought up in a school system where it wasn't okay for them to be left-handed. So they learned how to write right-handed because they were required to by the school, but their eye patterns didn't change. Now, the quickest way to find out whether a person is normally organized or reverse organized is to ask them some questions. And we've laid these questions out for you very easily on page 24, and this will make them very easy to use. There's a number of questions here, and you can make up the questions as long as the questions have the same intent. So let's talk about that for a moment. If you make up a question that's not exactly the same as the questions that are here, you want to make sure that it requires them to access something that's rather in the way back in their memory, as opposed to something that's rather recent. If you get something that's way, way back in their memory, it's going to be a lot tougher for them to remember it, so they're going to have to probably move their eyes in a certain direction. If you say to a person, what color is your room right now, and they don't have to move their eyes up into visual recall, because it's so easy for them to remember, then you're not going to get a real good idea whether they're normally organized or reverse organized. But if they have to remember something that's way, way back there in the past, then it's probably more likely that as they remember that, they're going to have to move their eyes in that direction. So that's why these questions are set up this way. These are some pretty good questions, so they're not by no means the only questions, but let's see what they are. So, and you can just go right down the list. In fact, what I would think that this week you might want to grab this chart and maybe your eye pattern questions as you go out and ask people, these questions. Notice they move their eyes in certain directions. So visual remembered is actually seeing images from memory or recalling things that you've seen before. And the question is, what was the color of the room you grew up in? Now, I have to admit, I did a business training in the United Kingdom, and there were some folks in the UK who objected to this question. So here's another question that will work, I think, equally as well, which is, what was the color of the first car you ever owned? And typically, if the person's normally organized, they should move their eyes up and to the right as you look at them. Okay, visual constructed. And these are images of things that people have never seen before. They're making it up in their head, for example. And if that's the case, they're using visual construct. So the question is, what would your room, or if you used car, what would your car look like if it were blue? Now, if the car was blue, obviously you'd pick a different color, right? So, and I oftentimes like to use a bright pink or some off-the-wall color so that they really do have to construct it. Okay, next is auditory remember, and that's where you remember sounds or voices that you've heard before or things that you've said to yourself before. One of the things I like to say is, growing up, did you have a favorite pet? What was the sound of your pet's voice? Or, what was the last thing I said? Or, can you remember the sound of your mother's voice? The problem with the last thing I said, although it's useful, they may simply defocus their eyes again. If they're normally organized, they should move their eyes horizontally and to the right. Auditory construct, that's making up sounds you've not heard before. What would I sound like if I had Donald Duck's voice? And that's auditory construct. If they're normally organized, they should move their eyes horizontally to the left. Then auditory digital, this is where your eyes go when you're talking to yourself. That's internal dialogue. Can you recite the Pledge of Allegiance to yourself? This is useful in the United States. It isn't useful outside the U.S. because we're the only people that have, the only country that has a Pledge of Allegiance, as far as I know. So then you could say, if you had somebody who didn't grow up here in the U.S., you could say, is there a poem from grade school that you can remember? Or can you say the times table for times 7 to yourself? Those are also useful in producing auditory digital. That's where the eyes, and they'll move downward and to the right as you look at the person. Then kinesthetic, and that's feelings or a sense of touch. And generally you look in this direction when you're accessing your feelings. You could say, do you have a favorite beach or place in the outdoors to walk? What does it feel like to walk there without shoes? Or what does it feel like to touch a wet rug? So those are all questions that are going to get in your client a certain response, and hopefully the client will move them. Well, hopefully the client will move their eyes in a certain direction. The client will move their eyes in a certain direction as you do that, and I think probably one of the best things to do is in the next few days is to take both of these pages, 23 and 24, out and ask your friends some questions. Ask your friends some of these questions and notice what direction they move their eyes. Now, here's something that's really important. Some people move their eyes very, very, very quickly. So if you ask them a question like, whatever the question is, blah, 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 like, what was the color of the room you grew up in? And you're looking down at the paper when you read that question. They could have moved their eyes so quickly, bang, they could have moved their eyes so quickly that by the time you look up, they haven't moved their eyes again. They moved them back and they're already back to looking at you again. So these questions should be asked while you have your eyes on the client. So if you're gonna go out and practice this week, hold the paper in your hand, look at the question, like read the question yourself, like what was the color of the first car you ever owned? Then look up at the person and say, what was the color of the first car you ever owned? That way they will go back and have to remember it, but you'll be looking at them and you'll actually be able to see the shift in their eye patterns as you do this. Sometimes people can access them so quickly that you won't notice, so you got to keep your eyes on them. And some people do it with micro muscle movements so that their eyes don't move that much. So you may be able to notice the micro muscle movements at this point. I think certainly you probably have enough sensory acuity by now that you could. If you've been doing the other sensory acuity exercises, you'll be able to pick up those micro muscle movements very easily. Oh, yeah. One more thing. I once worked with a client in Hawaii who had a don't look to talk rule. And her don't look to talk rule was actually very interesting to me because she was a Hawaii-born Filipino. And the Filipinos in Hawaii have a don't look to talk rule. So she would look away from me when I was talking to her. And I walked into the office and she was working at an engineering firm. We were consulting there in Hawaii. And I walked into the office and sat down in the chair. And I said to her, what was the color of the room you grew up in? And she moved her eyes upward and to the left as I looked at her. And so I thought, oh, okay, she's reverse organized. That's possible. So then I said, what was the color of, what would your room look like if we painted it a bright orange? And she looked upward and to the left again. And I went, whoa. Now she's accessing both visual recall and visual construct as I look at her at the upper left-hand side. And she accessed all auditory on the left-hand side and all kinesthetic and all auditory digital on the left-hand side, to make a long story short. I went back to the office and I was so excited. I said, all right, we got one. This one's different from everybody else. I found somebody that's an exception to the eye pattern chart. Whoa! And we got we were going to write an article, and publish it in the whatever. We're going to publish it somewhere because we had somebody that accessed everything on the left-hand side. And then I got smart. And I went back the next week. Yeah. What happened there, Tad? How'd you get smart? I went back the next week, and I sat on the other side of her. And lo and behold, she accessed, I said, what's the color of the room you grew up in? And she accessed everything on the right hand. She moved her eyes up and to the right. And I said, what would it look like if we painted it bright orange? And she moved her eyes up and to the right. And she accessed everything, visual recall, visual construct on the right, auditory construct, auditory recall on the right, kinesthetic and auditory digital on the right. So what she had was a don't look at me to access your memories. And each time she looked away. And she was good enough where she could actually look away from you and pick up everything that she needed to pick up simply by looking in the other direction, which I thought was quite interesting. So when you access eye patterns, I think you probably ought to sit directly across from the person. Now, there are some exceptions to sitting directly across from the person that we use in NLP, but my preference would be that when you're doing this exercise, my preference would be that you're sitting directly across from the person and asking them the questions. Now, you may notice that your partner defocuses his or her eyes to access something. And rather than going to one of the quadrants, they just defocus their eyes. What that's about is that they have a preferred representational system, and they're accessing that preferred representational system right on the surface so that they defocus their eyes and pick up the information which is readily available, and they don't have to go searching for it too much. They don't have to go really deeply into it too much. And so I think if you pay attention to that, you'll be in good shape. There's one other thing I want to talk about before you actually go and do this exercise. I think that's important too. You may also notice that the client moves their eyes into two locations. when they were attempting to, in the Pentagon, when they were attempting to debunk NLP, one of the things they said was that NLP wasn't accurate, or didn't actually work because the eye patterns didn't work. And what they noticed was that the generals, when they would ask a general a question, the general would move his eyes down and to the right as you look at him. And then, like, let's say it said to the general, what color was the room you grew up in? He would move his eyes down and to the right as you look at him, and then up to the right to visual recall. And so what they said was, well, this isn't terribly accurate because the general's moving his eyes to where you say is auditory digital. But the fact is the general was repeating the question before he actually accessed the information. So if you're going to go out and use this and test it, and I think it really is useful to test this, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. I think it really is useful to test it, but be aware that some people may have to repeat the question. In addition, some people may have a synesthesia, which means that they can access one representational system, or they will access one representational system in order to pick up another one. That's also a possibility. Now, this particular information, what would I use this for? This particular information, to me, this is really a major strength when I do consulting with kids, educational consulting. And you may know of a kid who's not doing well in school. Gosh, isn't that the worst thing? You poor kid, and what do kids know? I mean, kids do the best they can, I mean, I think all kids really want to do the best they can. But this poor kid, and the kids, people tell you, or you're stupid, or you can't learn, or whatever. But the fact is that kids really do want to do the best they can. But many kids, they call them, they label them learning disabled in some way. And the fact is that it's simply the use of an inappropriate representational system. Now, that's now called dyslexia. And here's the possibility. Here's some possibilities. Let's look at the eye chart on page 23. A child who is labeled dyslexic, probably the quickest thing to ask this child is, what was the color of the room you grew up in? And notice where the child looks. Notice if their visual recall is on the right-hand side. You could also ask them, how do you spell success, and watch their eyes. Most of the kids that I've worked with, in fact, 99% of the kids I've ever worked with, when you say to them, how do you spell success, they'll either be going to visual construct or they'll be going down to kinesthetic. And I'm going to tell you something. Kinesthetic is not the place to spell success successfully. Successfully needs to be spelled in visual recall. So the quickest thing you can teach the child is to take the word success and put it up in the visual recall. And then, so here's what I'll say to the child. I'll say to him, look, visual recall, put this up, and to your, well, in this case, visual recall is going to be up and to the child's left. So you say to the child, put this up and to your left. As you look at them, it's going to be their right. And have them look at the word as they move their eyes into visual recall. As they move their eyes into visual recall, then have them, and break the word into syllables. That's the easiest way. So it would be S-U-C, and then put a dot there, and then C-E-S-S. Then, as they spell it, you tell them and then do it in two different colors. So make the S-U-C in blue and the C-E-S-S in red. So you'd say, spell the blue, and the child will go S-U-C, spell the red, C-E-S-S. Spell the blue, S-U-C, spell the red, C-E-S-S. Spell the blue, S-U-C, spell the red, C-E-S-S. Spell the red, C-E-S-S, spell the blue, S-U-C. Spell the blue, S-U-C, spell the red, C-E-S-S. And have them do that until you're bored with it. And then have them close their eyes and spell it. So now spell the blue, S-U-C, spell the red, C-E-S, and then tell them to spell it backwards. And they'll probably go S-S-E-C-C-U-S. And when they do that, it'll blow them away. I had a 17-year-old girl who was branded dyslexic. She was getting A's and B's in school from the beginning of school until age 7 when the dyslexia specialist came into town. Great, huh? And the dyslexia specialist found, of course, that she had dyslexia. And from 7 to 17, she complied. Now, her father was a professor at Brigham Young University, so he knew that dyslexia existed. I don't believe in dyslexia per se, but he knew that it existed. He was a professor at Brigham Young University, and he brought me to her. And And so the first thing I said was, how do you spell success? And she went down into her kinesthetics. And so I knew that we had a really good, if the child goes to kinesthetics right away, you're going to know clearly that that you've got something you can do here. So I did the pattern with her, and then I had her spell it backwards, and she spelled it backwards perfectly. And her father was sitting there, and his mouth was wide open like this, wah. And she was all grins, and just, feeling really great about it. If you have a child who's been branded dyslexic, they're probably simply using an inappropriate representational system. They may also not have picked a dominant hemisphere yet. Depending on how old they are, you may need to have them pick a dominant hemisphere, or you may need to teach them things which go across the hemispheres. If you're going to work a lot with kids, you may want to read Swassing and Barbie, and the name of the book is Teaching Through Modality Strengths. You may also want to read some things on educational kinesiology. Among other things, there are things which cause the person to cross-crawl or to use both hemispheres. Cross-crawling can be quite useful in terms of getting the child to pick a dominant hemisphere, or at least to synchronize both hemispheres. Usually the kids who are branded dyslexic are simply using an inappropriate representational system or are trying to remember stuff in visual construct. So it's really important, I think, these eye patterns are so useful to be able to work with a child in a system and moving beyond that. And they're also useful in business. If a person continually accesses a construct when he should be going to recall, you may have a person who is not giving you the full story or not giving you the full amount of information. If a person is gone to auditory recall and then back to auditory construct, you may not be getting the exact story. So that's a very useful way to use that in business. And when you come to the practitioner training, we'll talk a little bit more about other uses in business. One of the things that I've done is I've used this very, very successfully in negotiation. Let me tell you a story. I was at one point hired by a group of North American natives from southwestern Alaska to assist them in getting a $7 million loan. And I got a call from the head of the business who said, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, has just told us that they're not going to look at our loan application for 6 months to a year from now. We can't survive for 6 months from here. We need a loan now because we're in the process of building this great resort up in Alaska. So the four of us hopped on a plane. I was in Hawaii and the three guys from Alaska, and we flew down to Washington. And we got into the BIA and the Department of the Interior, and the first guy we met with, we started to talk to him. And we used rapport in groups. Now, I think if I were going to do negotiation, and I do a fair amount of negotiation, I think whenever I do negotiation, I would like to have at least an equivalent number of people on my team as they have on their team. And not for a show of force and not for a show of power, but for people to be able to match and mirror specifically other people. Match and mirror them so that they would be able to use this to bring the whole group into rapport. And we did this in Washington, D.C. We had the two native guys. We actually had the chief and his son, and the CEO was carrying the bulk of the digital information, so he did what he could. But then I matched and mirrored one of the BIA guys, and then the chief and his son matched and mirrored the other BIA guys. And then halfway through, we switched it. And I can tell you all about that when you come to the practitioner training, because we've got diagrams on the whole thing. But anyway, at the end of that, the guy said, in 20 years of government, I've never seen my boss so excited about any project that's ever been brought to him. And your project isn't anything special. I don't understand. What do you guys have that no one else has? And I said, well, we're just a bunch of nice guys from Alaska. But the fact is, I would credit rapport with being able to do that. I would say that anytime you're going to negotiate, anytime you're going to do a major sales presentation, whether it's one-on-one or two-on-two or whatever, that you want to be very, very careful to look across at the person and notice their eye patterns, notice their predicates, and we'll show you how to use eye patterns and predicates as we move forward into strategies in a later one of these programs. But use rapport. Use it and use it in groups and use it with individuals because it will really, really make a major difference. There's a couple things I want to define here before we finish up with eye patterns. I want to define the lead representational system and the primary representational system. And these are simply definitions. the lead representational system and the primary representational system. Okay, so the lead representational system relates to eye patterns. It's how does the client lead, or where do they go to access most of their information? It's how they access their world internally. The primary representational system is comprised of the predicates and their physiology. And we talked about the physiology for each kind of person. So the predicates and physiology are how they represent the internal world to the outside world. How they represent the internal world to the outside world. And so lead representational system is their eye patterns, primary rep system is their predicates and their physiology. I think you should write that down somewhere because it's on the test. Or you might want to write it right on the test. That's something that's just definitions, but I think it's important to remember. So have fun with rapport. Go out and get into rapport with people. I think people ought to be able, I think actually more people ought to be able to get into rapport with each other, but I think you should practice it. I think you should practice it until it's something you know that you can do second nature. Automatically walk into a client or walk in and meet with someone, sit down, match and mirror them and go into rapport. Match their predicates, their physiology, their voice, match their posture, their breathing, their blinking. Match all of this. Totally match it. And who knows, you might need it one day. You might need it one day. Remember, if you get any resistance, it's a sign of lack of rapport. It's simply inadequate rapport, in which case you simply go back and match and mirror the person more. You can also match and mirror their model of the world. You can match their key phrases. You can match their predicates. Totally match and mirror. And remember, if you already have rapport with the unconscious mind, you don't need any more of this, but you certainly can get rapport with the client's unconscious mind when you need it. And you may need it one day. You might be where I was in a hotel in Anchorage. It was a really awful hotel. And I am so glad I had rapport that day because it really, really made a difference. I promise you, if you use it carefully, it's something it'll totally repay your use and no one will notice because it'll be totally unobtrusive. So for the rest of this training, I'm going to suggest that whenever you're working with someone else, that you do match and mirror them. So we want you to practice this enough so that when you're done, you'll at least be able to be at choice about it. This is the end of program number 5. Thanks for listening. Come and join us for number 6, which follows.